Hi, y'all. Welcome back to another episode. This is Marriage Made Possible, where we believe that all things are possible, including happy and great marriages. My name is Jasmine.
And I'm Troy, and we want to thank you all for tuning in this week. If you missed last week's video, we want to encourage you to go back and check it out. We talked about self awareness, and I believe self awareness is one of those things that's just not talked about a lot. Three of the things that we hit on in regards to self awareness was what is self awareness? We also talked about the importance of self awareness. Lastly, we covered the danger of the lack of self awareness.
Yeah, that was a really great video. So if you all haven't gotten the opportunity to go check it out, the title of it is called Navigating Triggers in Marriage. And so, like Troy said, we really believe that that video has a lot of great information that could benefit you and your relationship, whether you're married, whether you're single, you're dating. It has a lot of great information that could benefit you all. So this week, we are going to continue talking about triggers in our trigger series. It's really specifically today, we're going to focus on how to identify what your triggers are. And I think that that's, other than knowing what a trigger is, identifying your triggers in marriage or just as an individual person is really kind of like the first step to becoming better and pinpointing maybe some of the root causes of the issues that you may have, as an individual person or in marriage. And so when we talk about what a trigger is and how to identify your trigger, a trigger is really just an external factor that can cause an internal unexpected response. So normally a trigger cannot be controlled, right? So it's something that, can happen on the outside. So it can be a particular person that can be a trigger for you. It can be a situation. A trigger can even be a smell. It can be an environment. So all of these things externally can impact some type of intense emotional response that is more than likely uncontrolled and unexpected.
So we start thinking about, well, how do I know if I've been triggered? Well, that's the key right there, the intense response. And usually a lot of times the response doesn't fit the situation.
Yeah.
Like the response is over the top.
I think a good way to look at it is, we're trying to measure this on a scale of 1 to 10. Your response could be a 10, but, whatever triggered you, the situation, it could be like at a level 2.
Right.
So, and then also I think another way to identify whether or not something is triggering you is, is this situation impacting or has the power to impact someone else? Like, are you mainly the only one that's being influenced by whatever the situation is? I think that's another good way to identify if something specifically is triggering you.
Something that I kind of thought about in regards to triggers and this intense response to an external situation is when I was going through EMT school and we were talking about allergic reactions. We learned that an allergic reaction is an intense reaction of the body or the immune system to something small that might not even trigger a response in somebody else's body.
Right.
So it could be something small, like an allergen is what we call them, like just a couple specks of pollen, or it could be blueberries rubbing up against your skin, or it could be something small like tasting strawberries that might not bother me, but in somebody that's allergic to those things, it can elicit a intense
response,
right, from the body.
Absolutely. And so another thing to think about when you talk about trigger is, trigger doesn't, when someone is triggered, it doesn't mean that they like there's this big blowout, right? Like I'm flipping tables over and I'm your intense emotional response could be a complete shutdown. Like you can be triggered and it can completely shut you down. You cannot want to talk to anybody for several days. You can completely withdraw emotionally. So that's something to think about as well. Like, how do you respond when you get triggered? Are you the type of person that when you get triggered, you blow up and things, there's a big blowout? Or is your intense emotional response causing you to withdraw emotionally and become disconnected from your spouse?
And these are kind of things that should start going off that, kind of alert you when you're thinking about, well, how do I know if I've even been triggered? Well, when you have a response that doesn't fit the situation, like my wife was just talking about, it might not necessarily be a blow up. It could be
Mm-hmm.
you shutting down. Some people freeze. You might just
Mm-hmm.
freeze.
Mm-hmm.
You go back to those situations, whatever it was, and think, hey, that wasn't normal. That response didn't fit that situation. That might be a trigger. I
Mm-hmm.
might have just been triggered.
That's a really good point. And then
Mm-hmm.
also just, when you also talk about trigger, more than likely it is rooted in some type of past trauma.
Mm.
And it's important for you to be able to take that time once you start to identify, okay, like the repeated patterns of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
What is behind those repeated patterns of behavior? Is it a tone of voice? Is it a situation?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is causing you to respond in that certain way? And then also kind of go further back and do, have some more self awareness, what we were talking about last week,
Mm-hmm.
and see if you can identify maybe the root cause that, was related to any type of past trauma from your past. So childhood, it can be early adulthood,
Mm-hmm.
teenage years. And so more than likely, those triggers are rooted in past trauma that is
Mm-hmm.
either unidentified or
Mm-hmm.
unresolved.
Yeah, I think that's big. Those unidentified traumas,
Mm-hmm.
maybe those situations and things that we'd like to forget or that we'd like to sweep underneath the rug, can come out in the form of being triggered. And
Not can, but will,
right,
one way or
yeah,
another.
one way or another,
Yeah.
they're gonna come out if they're not dealt with,
Mm-hmm.
and it can leave your spouse completely unaware. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what's going on? Why are you responding like that? Why
Mm-hmm.
are you, all I said was X, Y, Z, but they have no idea that XYZ is what Uncle Bubba used to say, and it just triggered something in you. It
Yeah.
just took you back to a certain moment, you know.
Yeah, absolutely, y'all. And this, just the whole topic of triggers and you just really taking the time, like it's a lot of hard work.
Mm-hmm.
It's individual work. Like you identifying your triggers is not some the work that your spouse can do. So this is not like a couple assignment.
Mm-hmm.
This is an individual assignment that only you know the answer to and only
Mm-hmm.
you can do the work for.
Yeah.
Your spouse can help maybe call out
Mm-hmm.
your behavior. So if your
Yeah.
spouse notice that, okay, every time we talk about this or every time this happens, you respond this way.
Mm-hmm.
So your spouse can help you maybe identify the external behaviors, but only you as an individual person, as a wife, as a husband, can do the work of identifying what your triggers are and how to navigate those triggers and really how to get better at overcoming what the triggers are because you can get better.
Yeah, you can get better. And that's, kind of one of the important factors of self-awareness that we covered in the previous video. And that's why it is so important, because it does take some self-awareness. And it's not pretty. This is the hard work. This is rolling up your sleeves, getting in the mud. And this is, like I like to say, turning that gaze inward and examining yourself and say, this is ugly. This is not pretty, but this is something that I need to deal with. This is a part of me that needs to be dealt with for the betterment of the marriage.
Right.
And not just the betterment of the marriage, it's so you can show up and be a great spouse, so you can show up and be a great parent.
Yeah.
Also, so, these things don't have power over you for the rest of your life, and you can kind of take back some authority in your life, some mental freedom.
So an unidentified trigger, it's almost kind of like a doorman that blocks you from becoming your best self.
Wow.
So if you think about like a doorman, right, and how they protect people from coming in and out of the building, when you don't know what your triggers are, that can block you from walking into everything that God will want for you, for your life, and for yourself as an individual person.
Wow.
So an unidentified trigger blocks you from being your best self.
Wow.
An unidentified trigger also produces uncontrolled thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. So when you don't know what your triggers are, more than likely you will not have control over your emotions, your thoughts, and your behavior, because it's almost like you're fighting an invisible enemy.
Wow.
And you don't know what you're fighting against.
Mm-hmm.
But once it's identified, once you know, okay, this person is a trigger for me, this environment is a trigger for me, once you have put a name
Mm-hmm.
to whatever that situation is, whatever that trigger is, then you know how to navigate and how to prepare yourself to respond in a different way.
Yeah, that's big. If you can't see the enemy, we call it guerrilla warfare. You don't know where the attack is coming
Mm-hmm.
from. That's kind of what an unidentified trigger is. You're walking into an ambush. You have no idea this
Mm-hmm.
thing is coming. And that's kind of what it's like in a marriage when
Mm-hmm.
somebody has no idea what your triggers are. You don't know what they are. And then, boom, somebody steps on a landmine, it just
It's a blow
explodes.
up.
Right. But
Mm-hmm.
when you do know what you're fighting and you're in the midst of it, you can call it out.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm aware of my triggers, then that means that I can bring them to you and say,
Absolutely.
hey, babe,
Yeah.
when you said this like that, it just brought me back to my childhood
Yeah.
and XYZ happened and
Yeah.
it created this kind of response and
Yeah.
it created this kind of emotion. And that's why I reacted this way.
Mm-hmm.
And my reaction didn't fit the situation because it wasn't you and you didn't know, but this happened
Mm-hmm.
or this reminded me of that.
Yeah. And, even identifying what your triggers are and being able to communicate that with your spouse, it can cause just such a great intimacy between you and your spouse,
Right.
an emotional and mental intimacy. So it's
Mm-hmm.
definitely the two becoming one. So when I know what my triggers are, I have self awareness,
Mm-hmm.
I can communicate it to my husband. And although, he can't help me control how I respond. He can
Mm-hmm.
encourage me.
Right.
He can support me. He can kind of, bring me out of whatever emotional state I'm in if I share that with him and if
Mm-hmm.
he's in the know of what's going on with me.
Great stuff. So we've talked about what triggers are. We ran down kind of how do you know when you've been triggered, and then we also kind of touched on the consequences of
Yeah.
unidentified triggers. So I guess as we're kind of walking down this path here, my next question is what to do once you've been triggered.
So I think the first, even before we talk about like what to do once you've been triggered, I
Mm-hmm.
think the first step is to identify the what.
Okay.
So, is it a person that is
Mm.
triggering you?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a situation? Is it a particular environment?
Mm.
What is triggering you? Is it, a certain topic? You
Mm-hmm.
have to know what it is because once you know what it is, then you can start working on, okay, what do I need to do?
Mm-hmm.
So in counseling, we teach people to, to deal with triggers. To first, number one, if you can't avoid it,
Mm-hmm.
right? But a lot of times you can avoid trigger.
Mm-hmm.
So the next thing we teach people to do is to deal with it head on. And in order to deal with the trigger head on, you have to have some type of plan. So whether it's a coping, skill, whether it's okay, once I'm triggered, I'm going to call this person
Mm-hmm.
to talk about what's going on with me. I'm gonna go, journal or do whatever. Like you
Mm-hmm.
need to have a plan once you know that you've been triggered.
Mm.
So I think the first step in this, topic of identifying trigger is to know what the what is, to put a
Right.
name to it.
Yeah, I think that just kind of goes back to what we were just saying about being able to call out the enemy,
Mm-hmm.
the distance and direction. Um, so I think that's big. The what
Mm-hmm.
behind the trigger, so we know what we're fighting here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you said something that's big. Hey, if you can avoid it
Mm-hmm.
altogether. And I know a lot of times you're like, what? Avoid it? Are you teaching us to run from our problems? No, that's not what we're teaching you to do. But in some situations and instances, when it comes to triggers, you might just need to avoid it. You might
Yeah.
need to avoid that person. You might need to avoid that situation.
That environment.
You have no
Mm-hmm.
business walking down that particular path because when you do, it sets you off
Mm-hmm.
and you know it.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you don't know it, but you're starting to realize
Yeah.
it. Some of you do know it. You know, if I get around this family member, if I get around cousin, auntie, and them, I'm gonna get set off.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you need to avoid those
Yeah.
situations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
And that's something else powerful as well. A lot of times we teach people that because it's family or because it's this person or that person,
Mhm.
that we have an obligation to them,
Mhm.
right? But if they're not good for your mental, your emotional state of being,
Mhm.
whether it's a family, whether it's a lifelong friend, if they're not healthy for you, then I would suggest putting some distance between in that relationship. And then in some cases, just cut it off altogether.
Something else that you just brought up was learning coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
And something that just immediately came to mind is self care.
Yeah.
And so when you're triggered, you might need to go back and I know we had mentioned in another one of our videos some things that have helped us. You might need to talk to that accountability partner. This would be a great time when you're triggered. Hey, I need to go talk to my accountability person. And remember that an accountability partner is somebody that you've given access to your life. This is somebody that's not going to judge you. It's a judgment-free zone, judgment-free individual, somebody that's been there, done that, got a t-shirt, that's going to be able to walk side by side with you, lock arms, and say, "Hey, let's walk this thing out." You might need to go get counseling, and you might need to start with individual counseling.
Yeah.
You might need to unpack some things and say, "Hey, I've never dealt with this, and this is proven to be an issue. When I was single, I thought I was good, but now that I'm married, this thing is popping up,
More and more.
right, more and more, and it's something that I need to deal with." Self-care and self-awareness go hand in hand. In fact, I would say that self-awareness is part of self-care. As you're doing that work of self-awareness, it's a type of self-care.
Yeah.
So other things that you can do when you're triggered is, you might just need to go and cool down. You need to remove yourself from that situation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes you try to stick it out and I can handle it and I can come back. No, you might need to make a beeline for the door. And sometimes you need to swallow your pride and you need to say to yourself, "Hey, you know what? I feel like I'm being triggered right now and I just need to exit."
Yeah, and that's something that you do all the time. And like when we talk about, coping and what helps us once we feel like we've been triggered, Troy and I are completely different. So he needs to remove himself like from the physical situation. So he'll go for a drive, he'll go to the gym, he'll go inside of another room. And I've learned over the past couple years of our marriage that is self-care for him. Like he needs that time to go, because if he stays in the situation, in that environment, then he's going to be triggered and he's going to have an uncontrolled emotional response. For me, I can stay in the same physical environment, but I need more so a mental and emotional release. So I can stay sitting, in the same physical environment, but I need to go journal. I need to go pray. I need to do those things in order for me to cope with whatever emotion that I'm dealing with.
Yeah, that's big. And some of you want to follow each other around and one of y'all needs to be big enough to just say,
and mature enough.
"Hey, you know what? This is not good for you. It's not good for me. I need to step away." And it has nothing to do with I'm gonna fight it out. We got to get to the bottom of this right now. If you feel yourself getting to where the argument, the discussion is not fruitful anymore, and you feel yourself being triggered, and you start to realize and recognize the responses that you're having. Hey, this response doesn't fit this situation. Why am I getting upset? Why am I shutting down? Why am I freezing? Why do I have anxiety right here? If you start feeling any one of those emotions that's not healthy, you might need to just exit the situation. Self-care looks different for everybody, but you might need to go give yourself some self-care. And it's as simple as saying, "You know what, babe? I love you enough to work on me right now." And that doesn't make you the weak person. That just makes you a mature person that recognizes where you are at that particular moment in time. Whatever self-care looks like for you, you might need to stop and go do that and blow some steam off. That doesn't mean that we just completely avoid the topic and the situation.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, you still have to come back and talk about whatever the discussion was. And so what we've learned how to do, what has really helped in our relationship, if we're having a conversation and either one of us, needs to time out, we'll give ourselves an hour. So, I'll be like, "All right, I need time." Troy will say, he needs time. And we know that within an hour, we're coming back and we're talking about whatever the situation is. Now, when we go away for that hour, we're not going and, ruminating on how upset the other person made us, or "I can't believe they said this or that." We're cooling down. We're, either praying, thinking, positive thoughts, thinking about marriage,
Mm-hmm.
thinking about our spouse. How can, maybe what are some of the things we could have said that was different?
Right.
Did we say or do anything wrong that caused our spouse to be triggered?
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll come back and the conversation can go from there.
Right. So we want to come back when cooler heads prevail, and we want to come back when we're in a different headspace
Hmm.
and talk about this when we're both at a point in a place where we can hear and understand.
Yeah. So, identifying the what, um, then really identifying like the repeated patterns of
Mm-hmm.
how are you responding. So once you're triggered, do you, blow up? Do you withdraw? Really identifying and taking track of what your response is.
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, communicating with your spouse on what is triggering you and what you need once you're triggered.
Right. So Galatians 5:9 in the Passion Translation um, says, "Don't you know that when you allow even a little lie into your heart, it can permeate your entire belief system?" So sometimes when you're triggered, it can be the result of a lie that you were told, something that somebody said to you, something that somebody said about
Mm-hmm.
you that you heard, and you've internalized that and you said, "This is who I am," or "This is what I am. This
Mm-hmm.
label defines me." And so some of you, a trigger is nothing more than a lie that you
Mm-hmm.
need to take the time and identify.
Mm-hmm.
For a lot of us, sometimes a trigger might not necessarily be something that happened to us, but it can be a lie that we believe about ourselves
Mm-hmm.
that we need to address and say, "I am not that person. I am not that problem."
We challenge you all to walk through these steps. If anything that we have said throughout this video is resonating with you all, if you feel like you have kind of been in like a cycle of being triggered and not knowing why, we challenge you to really take some time and identify what is triggering you. Is it a
Mm-hmm.
person? Is it a place? Is it an environment? Identify the what, and then take some time and reflect on how you have been responding. So, what are the repeated patterns of behavior
Mm-hmm.
that you have been showing, whether or not it's in your marriage, at work, in the family, whatever? And then take some time and really identify what can help you. So, what are
Mm-hmm.
some coping skills that you can implement that will help you once you're triggered? And I think that you definitely start from there.
Mm-hmm.
So next week we will continue this conversation about triggers. Next week we're going to talk about how to communicate with your spouse once you have been triggered, to communicate what
Mm-hmm.
your needs are so that you all can overcome that situation together.
Yeah, so we want to encourage you. Don't forget to comment, like, share, subscribe. Maybe you got it all figured out. You got the perfect marriage. I get it. But pass it on to somebody who you know needs it. Man, you can think of somebody when you're listening to this video. Hey, this might help them. This might benefit them. Look, go ahead and find us on all the socials. You can find us on YouTube at Marriage Made Possible, on Instagram at Marriage Made Possible, on Facebook at Marriage Made Possible.